Let me tell you something that took me decades to fully understand. Even though the math was obvious from the start, every hour you trade for money is an hour that dies the moment you stop working. There is no compounding, no multiplication, no freedom, just an endless treadmill where your income stops the second you do. Most people spend their entire lives as time renters, and they wonder why they never get ahead. They're smart, they work hard, they make decent money, but they're stuck in a fundamentally flawed equation. The equation goes like this. Your income equals your hours multiplied by your rate. And the only way to earn more is to work more hours or negotiate a higher rate, both of which have hard ceilings. Now, I'm not here to romanticize entrepreneurship or tell you that starting a business solves everything. Most businesses fail, and most of the ones that survive still trap their owners in the same time for money exchange, just with more stress and longer hours. What I'm talking about is something different entirely. Owning assets that compound independently of your time. Here's the inversion that changed everything for Warren and me. Instead of asking, how do I make more money? We asked, how do I build something that makes money whether I'm working or sleeping? That single question reframes the entire game. You're no longer optimizing for income. You're optimizing for compounding systems that grow without consuming your life. The mathematics are brutally simple, yet most people never internalize them. Linear growth, what you get from trading time for money, is predictable, safe feeling, ultimately limiting. But that's only half of it. The real lesson is this. Stop doing things that prevent compounding from working. Warren and I didn't interrupt the process by selling C's when it doubled. We didn't siphon off all the cash flow for consumption, and we didn't diversify into businesses we didn't understand just because they seemed exciting. The psychology of human misjudgment explains why so few people escape the time for money trap, even when they intellectually understand it's a trap. First, there's incentive-caused bias. Your current employer rewards you for trading time. So your brain optimizes for what gets measured and rewarded right now. Second, there's social proof. Everyone around you trades time for money, which makes it feel normal and safe. Third, there's deprival superreaction syndrome. The fear of losing your steady paycheck feels more real than the potential of future compounding. I see this pattern repeatedly in smart, capable people who should know better. They're making $150,000 a year working 60-hour weeks, and they can't imagine walking away from that income, even temporarily, to build something that compounds. The opportunity cost thinking is completely backwards. They're calculating what they'll lose this year while ignoring what they'll gain over the next 30 years. Now, I'm not suggesting you quit your job tomorrow and gamble everything on an unproven idea. That's not rationality. That's stupidity disguised as courage. What I'm suggesting is that you need to start building compounding systems while you still have the income to support yourself. Start small. Stay within your circle of competence and protect your downside like your life depends on it, because in a real sense, it does. Here's the multidisciplinary insight that pulls this all together. From mathematics, you learn that exponential growth always beats linear growth given enough time. It's not a matter of opinion, it's arithmetic. From psychology, you learn that humans are terrible at delayed gratification and need systems to overcome their own biases. From biology, you see that organisms, which compound their advantages through evolution, learning, or network effects, dominate their ecosystems over time. The businesses Warren and I gravitated toward all had one thing in common. They could compound without consuming proportional amounts of capital. Coca-Cola could sell more cases of Coke without building proportionally more factories. The brand did most of the work. Our insurance businesses collected premiums up front and paid claims later, giving us float that we could invest and compound. These weren't accidents. We specifically hunted for businesses with these characteristics because we understood the power of compounding. Compare that to a consulting business where revenue scales almost perfectly with headcount. Hire 10 consultants, get 10 times the billing capacity, but also 10 times the complexity, 10 times the management overhead, and zero compounding benefits. Or a restaurant where adding a second location means doubling your capital investment, your operational risk, and your time commitment. These businesses trap you just as surely as a job does. Sometimes worse, because now you can't even take a vacation. The transition from time renter to asset owner requires a fundamental shift in how you think about value creation. When you're trading time for money, you're optimized for efficiency. How much can I bill per hour? How many hours can I work? When you're building compounding assets, you're optimized for leverage. How can I create value once and capture it repeatedly? How can I make my winners run while cutting my losers quickly? I learned this lesson the hard way in my early career as a lawyer. I was good at law. I could bill high rates. I worked hard, and I was absolutely trapped. Every dollar I made required another hour of my life, and there were only so many hours I could sell. The moment I stopped billing, the income stopped. That's when I realized I was building someone else's compounding machine, the law firms, while renting out my own time like a piece of equipment. The real inflection point came when I started making investments that could compound without my direct involvement. Early real estate deals, eventually partnership investments, and finally the structures that became Berkshire Hathaway. Each step reduced my dependence on selling time and increased my exposure to compounding returns. It wasn't fast, it wasn't smooth, and I made plenty of mistakes along the way, but the trajectory was clear. Here's the brutal truth about patience and compounding that nobody wants to hear. The first 5 years feel like nothing is happening. You're building assets that generate modest returns while watching your peers make more money than you by trading time. The next 5 years feels slightly better, but not dramatically different. But somewhere around year 15 or 20, if you haven't interrupted the process, something remarkable happens. Your assets generate more income than you could possibly earn trading time, and the gap grows wider every year. That's why saying no becomes your most valuable skill as an asset owner. Every hour you spend on something that doesn't compound is an hour stolen from things that do. Every dollar you consume instead of reinvest is a dollar that can't multiply. Every shiny opportunity outside your circle of competence is a distraction that interrupts the compounding process. Warren and I built Berkshire by saying no to thousands of investments for everyone we said yes to. The multidisciplinary approach reveals why this works across domains. In physics, you learn about momentum and inertia. Systems that are already in motion tend to stay in motion, and compound growth builds massive momentum over time. In economics, you understand increasing returns to scale and network effects advantages that multiply rather than add. In history, you see that the great fortunes were built not by people who worked the hardest, but by people who owned assets that compounded while they slept. Let me give you another concrete example from our portfolio. We owned a significant stake in Coca-Cola, not because we thought we could time the market perfectly or because the stock was statistically cheap in some complicated way. We owned it because every time someone in Beijing or Mumbai buys a Coke instead of a local beverage, the brand becomes slightly more valuable through network effects and cultural reinforcement. That's compounding through customer behavior, not just financial engineering. Contrast that with the fate of most time renters, even highly successful ones. I've known doctors making $500,000 a year who retire with less wealth than investors who never made more than $100,000 annually. The difference isn't intelligence or work ethic. It's that one group spent decades building compounding assets while the others spent decades trading time for money. No matter how lucrative that trade appeared in the moment, the transformation happens when you finally internalize that your time is your only non-renewable resource. Money you can make back, reputation you can rebuild, even health you can sometimes recover. But time once spent is gone forever. Every hour you rent to someone else is an hour you can't invest in building assets that compound. The opportunity cost isn't just the money you're not making today, it's the compounding you're not experiencing over the next 30 years. Now, I need to address the common objections because they're predictable and worth examining. First objection, I don't have capital to invest in compounding assets. That's usually true, but irrelevant. You have time, skills, and intellectual capital that can be converted into assets that compound. Start with what you have, even if it's just knowledge you can package, systems you can build, or networks you can cultivate. Second objection, I can't afford to take the income hit. Then don't take it yet. Build your compounding assets on nights and weekends until they generate enough to replace your day job income. Impatience here is just another form of stupidity. Third objection: I don't know what kind of asset to build. Good. At least you're being honest about your circle of competence. Stay within what you understand. Study people who built similar assets successfully and start small enough that failure won't destroy you. Warren and I didn't wake up one day knowing how to run insurance companies and buy wonderful businesses. We learned by doing, made mistakes, and compounded our knowledge along with our capital. The rational action plan is simpler than people want to believe because simplicity feels like it can't possibly work. Here it is. Identify one skill or knowledge area where you're genuinely competent. Figure out how to package that into an asset that can scale without consuming proportional time. Build it methodically while maintaining your income and protect it from interruption once it starts compounding. That's not a get-rich scheme. It's a get-wealthy-slowly certainty if you don't screw it up. I've watched this play out thousands of times over 7 decades of investing in business. The people who build real wealth, the kind that lasts and provides genuine freedom, are almost never the ones who optimize for maximum short-term income. They're the ones who accepted lower income in their 20s and 30s in exchange for building assets that compounded into their 40s, 50s, and beyond. The math is relentless and unforgiving. Compound interest doesn't care about your feelings, your excuses, or your need for immediate gratification. Let me tell you what life looks like when you finally escape the time for money trap. You wake up and your assets have made more money while you slept than most people make in a week of work. You say no to opportunities that would consume your time, even lucrative ones, because you understand opportunity cost. You can focus on problems that interest you intellectually rather than problems that pay immediately. You're playing a completely different game than the time renters, and they can't even see the board you're playing on. But here's the part that surprises people. It's not mainly about the money, though the money is wonderful. It's about having control of your attention and your time, which are the only things that actually matter. When you're trading time for money, someone else controls your schedule, your priorities, your focus. When you own compounding assets, you control how you spend your days, and the quality of your life is ultimately nothing more than the quality of how you spend your days. The interdisciplinary insight that ties this together comes from understanding how systems compound in nature, business, and wealth building. In ecology, species that develop compounding advantages, better camouflage, more efficient metabolism, superior reproductive strategies dominate their niches over evolutionary time. In business, companies that build compounding Moe's brand loyalty network effects, switching costs capture disproportionate returns. In personal wealth, individuals who build compounding assets early and protect them from interruption achieve financial independence decades before their peers. I'm 99 years old now, and I've watched this pattern repeat so many times it's almost boring. Young person trades time for money, feels successful because the income is good, realizes 20 years later they're trapped and exhausted, or a young person builds modest compounding assets, struggles initially while peers out-earn them, reaches financial independence while those peers are still trapped. The second path requires more intelligence, more discipline, and much more patience, but it's the only path that actually works. Here's the final piece of wisdom I can share after a lifetime of studying this problem. The biggest mistake isn't starting with too little capital or picking the wrong business model or even failing a few times along the way. Those are all recoverable. The biggest mistake is interrupting the compounding process once it starts working. People build an asset that's generating modest returns, get impatient, sell it to try something more exciting, and restart the compounding clock at zero. That's not bad luck. That's stupidity. Warren and I held See's Candies for 5 decades, held Coca-Cola through multiple market cycles, held our insurance businesses through industry downturns, not because we're geniuses, but because we understand that compound interest requires time to work its magic. Every time you start over, you lose the exponential growth that comes from letting winners compound. That's why our investment approach looks boring to outsiders. We buy wonderful businesses, we pay fair prices, and then we do nothing. The doing nothing is the hardest part for most people. The transformation from time renter to asset owner isn't mystical or complicated. It's a straightforward application of mathematics, psychology, and rational decision-making. You need to understand exponential growth intellectually. You need to overcome your brain's bias toward immediate gratification emotionally. And you need to protect your compounding assets from interruption practically. That's it. Not easy, but simple. Let me give you one more concrete example of how this plays out in the real world. I know a man who spent 20 years building a software product that generates subscription revenue. The first 5 years he made less than he would have as an employed developer. The next 5 years he made about the same. But in years 10 through 20, as customer compounding kicked in and word of mouth scaled, his income grew exponentially, while his working hours actually decreased. Now he makes more in a month than he used to make in a year. And the business runs largely without him. Compare that to his peers who took the safe path of corporate employment. They're making good money, $200,000, $300,000, maybe more, but they're working harder than ever. And if they stop working, the income stops immediately. No compounding, no leverage, no escape. They traded 20 years of their lives for linear income, while my friend traded 20 years for an asset that compounds forever. Which path was actually safer? The answer depends entirely on your time horizon. If you're optimizing for this year's income, trading time for money looks safer. If you're optimizing for the next 30 years of income, building compounding assets is the only rational choice. Most people never consciously choose. They just follow the path of social proof, taking the same jobs their peers take and wondering why they never get ahead. Here's what I want you to understand at a deep level. Every day you spend trading time for money is a day you're not building compounding assets. The opportunity cost isn't just theoretical. It's the difference between eventual freedom and permanent dependence. You can't reclaim those days once they're gone. And compound interest doesn't care whether you started early or late. It just quietly rewards those who understand its power and punishes those who don't. The rationality here is stark and uncompromising. You have roughly 100,000 working hours in your life. If you work full-time for 40 years, you can rent those hours to someone else and convert them directly into income. Comfortable, predictable, and ultimately capped. Or you can invest some of those hours in building assets that compound independently of your time. Uncomfortable at first, uncertain in the middle, and eventually liberating. There is no third path. And choosing not to choose is just choosing the default path of time rental. I spent my early career confused about this. My middle career building compounding systems, and my later career watching those systems generate wealth far beyond what I could have earned trading time. The irony is that the total number of hours I worked probably wasn't that different from my peers, but the results were incomparable because I was building assets that multiplied my efforts rather than consuming them. Now you're probably asking yourself, what specific asset should I build? What business model works? What mistakes should I avoid? Those are good questions, but they're secondary to the primary insight. The specific asset matters less than understanding the principle. Own something that compounds. Stay within your circle of competence. Start with what you understand and protect your downside. The exact form software, rental properties, a service business with systems that run without you. Royalty-generating intellectual property matters far less than the underlying mathematics. Here's the mental model I want you to carry forward. Every financial decision you make is either compounding or consuming. Buying an asset that generates income is compounding. Buying a liability that consumes income is consuming. Trading your time for money is consuming. You're consuming your time, which is your only irreplaceable asset. Building systems that work without you is compounding. The question to ask about every opportunity isn't how much will I make, but rather will this compound or consume? The psychology of human misjudgment works against you here in predictable ways. Your brain craves immediate feedback, so trading time for money feels satisfying. Work today, get paid Friday, clear cause and effect. Building compounding assets means working for months or years before seeing meaningful returns, which triggers anxiety and doubt. You need to understand that this discomfort is a feature, not a bug. If it were easy and comfortable, everyone would do it, and the returns would be bid down to nothing. I've studied every great fortune built in the last century, and they all share the same underlying structure. Someone built an asset that compounded faster than they consumed its returns. Carnegie with steel, Rockefeller with oil, Ford with automobiles, Gates with software, Bezos with e-commerce platforms. The specifics vary wildly, but the mathematics are identical. They created value once and captured it repeatedly. They let their winners run, and they didn't interrupt the compounding process, chasing short-term excitement. The transition you need to make is both intellectual and emotional. Intellectually, you need to understand exponential growth, opportunity cost, and the mathematics of compounding. Emotionally, you need to overcome your bias toward immediate gratification, your fear of losing stable income, and your tendency to compare yourself to peers who are out earning you in the short term. Both are necessary. Neither alone is sufficient. Let me give you the final piece of actionable wisdom. Starting today, track how you spend every hour of your week, not in excruciating detail, but in broad categories. Hours trading time for money, hours building compounding assets, hours consuming entertainment, maintenance, rest. Most people discover they're spending 90% of their working hours renting time and zero building assets. That ratio needs to change, even if you start with just 5 hours a week. Because 5 hours a week compounded over a decade builds more than you can imagine. The mathematics of compounding work in your favor with startling power once you stop interrupting them. If you build an asset that grows 15% per year, not exceptional, just steady, it doubles every 5 years. In 30 years, it's 64 times larger. That's not luck or genius. That's just arithmetic applied patiently. But it only works if you stay within your circle of competence, and if you don't interrupt the process chasing illusory shortcuts. I'm not going to tell you this is easy because it isn't. Building compounding assets while your peers are making more money and buying nicer things requires discipline that most people don't possess. Saying no to lucrative opportunities because they don't compound requires clarity that most people never develop. Watching your assets grow slowly for years before the exponential curve kicks in requires patience that most people can't sustain. But the alternative, renting your time until you're too old to work, is far worse. The choice is yours, and it's binary. Continue trading your irreplaceable time for money, or start building assets that compound independently of your hours worked. There's no judgment either way, just mathematics and consequences. But understand this, every year you wait, you lose the compounding returns of that year plus all the years beyond it. Time is the only input to compound interest that you can't buy more of, and you're spending it right now, whether you're building assets or not. So, here's my final challenge to you, delivered with all the bluntness I can muster. Stop pretending that your job, no matter how prestigious or well paid, is building your future. It's not. It's consuming your present and mortgaging your future. Start building something that compounds, even if it's small, even if it's slow, even if your peers think you're crazy for accepting lower income now because the math is relentless. The clock is running, and compound interest doesn't wait for you to be ready. It just quietly rewards those who understand it and brutally punishes those who don't. The transformation I'm describing isn't theoretical. I've lived it. Warren's lived it. And thousands of successful investors have lived it. But here's what nobody tells you about the middle years. Year 3, year 5, year 7 are when most people break. You've built something generating modest returns, but nothing spectacular. And you're watching your college roommate buy a vacation home with his corporate bonus while you're reinvesting every dollar back into your compounding machine. That's the crucible where discipline gets tested. You've done everything right, built within your circle of competence, protected your downside, stayed patient, but the exponential curve hasn't kicked in yet. Your brain screams that you've made a terrible mistake. This is where understanding the psychology of human misjudgment becomes essential. You need to recognize that feeling as a predictable cognitive bias, not as useful information about reality. Let me tell you about a decision Warren and I made in Berkshire's early days that illustrates this perfectly. We had capital to deploy and two options: buy a mediocre textile business generating immediate cash flow, or buy an insurance company that would take years to reach potential but had genuine compounding characteristics through float. The textile business looked safer, more comfortable, more socially acceptable, and it would have been a disaster consuming our time and capital without compounding anything. We bought the insurance company and people thought we were insane. Insurance is boring, complex, regulated. Why would two smart guys waste their time on that when they could buy sexy growth stocks or proven cash flow businesses? Because we understood something they didn't. Insurance float compounds if you underwrite properly. You collect premiums today, invest them for years, eventually pay claims with depreciated dollars while keeping investment returns. That's compounding through financial structure. And it became the foundation of everything we built. But the key insight most people miss in that story isn't just picking the right business model, it's having the discipline to say no to everything else. We turned down hundreds of opportunities that would have generated faster returns, consumed our attention, or taken us outside our circle of competence. Every no protected the compounding process. Every yes would have interrupted it. Now, let me address something that confuses people about compounding: the difference between genuine assets and disguised time traps. I've seen countless entrepreneurs who think they've escaped the time for money trap because they own a business, but they're actually more trapped than they were as employees. They own a job, not an asset. If they stop working, the business stops functioning. That's not freedom, that's self-employment with extra stress. The test is simple and brutal. Can your asset generate income for 6 months while you do nothing? If no, you don't own a compounding asset. You own a time-consuming job that happens to have your name on the door. Real assets work without you. They might work better with your attention, but they fundamentally function independently of your daily involvement. I learned this distinction painfully in my early investment partnerships. I structured them requiring constant attention, reviewing positions, meeting partners, analyzing opportunities. Returns were excellent, but I was trapped the same way I'd been trapped as a lawyer. The breakthrough came when I realized the goal wasn't just making money, it was building a structure that made money while allowing me to think, read, and pursue intellectual interests without the tyranny of the urgent. That realization changed everything about how we structured Berkshire. We bought businesses with excellent managers who didn't need us interfering in daily operations. We avoided businesses requiring constant capital allocation decisions or hands-on oversight. We built systems that could compound for decades with minimal intervention from headquarters. This wasn't laziness, it was understanding that your attention is your scarcest resource and protecting it is essential to long-term compounding. Here's another mental model that serves well, a concept of negative compound interest. Just as assets compound positively, bad habits and poor decisions compound negatively. Every hour wasted on non-compounding activities is an hour lost forever. Every dollar consumed rather than invested is a dollar that can't multiply. Every distraction outside your circle of competence is a compounding error that costs you exponentially over time. Benjamin Franklin understood this centuries ago when he said that time is money. But he understood something deeper, that time converts into compounding assets or disappears into consumption, and that choice determines everything. Franklin built printing businesses that generated passive income, freeing him for science and diplomacy. He didn't trade his time for money in his 40s and 50s. His assets did the work while he pursued what interested him intellectually. The same pattern appears everywhere you look in history. The Rothschild family built a banking empire that compounded across generations because they understood financial systems and information advantages. The Rockefeller fortune came from building assets, oil refining capacity, transportation networks, distribution systems that created compounding advantages through economies of scale. These weren't accidents, these were deliberate applications of understanding how compound systems work. Compare that to the countless talented people who made fortunes trading their time. Surgeons, lawyers, consultants, executives, and ended up with far less wealth than investors who never earned as much annually. The difference is always the same. One group built compounding machines while the other rented their time, no matter how expensive that rental became. Here's what makes this particularly difficult. Society rewards time rental in the short term and punishes asset building. Your parents want you to get a prestigious job. Your peers judge you by your current income. Your spouse might pressure you for the lifestyle that comes with a corporate salary. All of these social pressures push you toward trading time for money, even when you intellectually understand it's the wrong path. This is where inversion thinking becomes critical. Don't ask, what should I do to get rich? Ask, what stupid mistakes do people make that keep them poor? The answers become obvious. They interrupt compounding. They consume instead of reinvest. They chase shiny opportunities outside their competence. They optimize for current income instead of future wealth. They listen to social pressure instead of mathematical reality. Avoid those mistakes, and building wealth becomes almost inevitable given enough time. It won't happen quickly. It won't be exciting, and your peers will think you're crazy for years. But the mathematics are relentless. Compound interest doesn't care about your social status or your peers' opinions. It just works quietly for those who understand it and ignores those who don't. Let me give you one final example that brings this full circle. I know a woman who spent 15 years building a portfolio of small rental properties. She worked a regular job, saved aggressively, bought properties methodically, and reinvested every dollar of rental income into more properties. For the first decade, she drove an old car and lived modestly, while her friends enjoyed expensive vacations and new homes. Today, 25 years later, her rental portfolio generates more income than she ever made working, and it requires maybe 10 hours of management per month. She's financially independent in her 50s, while her friends who earn more than her for decades are still trapped in corporate jobs they can't afford to leave. The mathematics worked exactly as predicted. The compound interest she earned on her patience now compounds forever. That's the transformation available to anyone willing to accept short-term sacrifice for long-term freedom. Not easy, not comfortable, not socially rewarded in the early years, but mathematically certain if you don't interrupt the process. And that's the final lesson. The biggest enemy of compounding isn't lack of opportunity or insufficient capital. It's impatience and the willingness to restart the clock, chasing faster results.